Society Hong Kong Center. It's Friday morning, beautiful here in Hong Kong, and I'm delighted that this morning I will have an opportunity to speak to a friend, Tyler Rollins, on the topic of spirituality in Southeast Asian art. And Tyler is joining us today, this morning, from South Carolina. So it's good evening to Tyler. And before I get started, I think you can see Tyler's impressive resume on our Asia Society Hong Kong website about this program. But I just wanted to mention something that has really been something that I've been so impressed with Tyler about. It's just he kind of had the foresight 20 years ago to really start looking at Southeast Asia and the artists that has become, that he has represented in the Tyler Rollins gallery, in his gallery, Tyler Rollins Fine Arts. So I think he was described by New York Times as one of the most reliably interesting spaces in Chelsea. And the galleries has done some wonderful exhibitions throughout the year, talking about linking spirituality, nature, and cultural tradition, and various forms of artistic expression. So I'm really delighted Tyler has agreed to join us this morning to talk about spirituality in Southeast Asian art. And one of the reasons that we're having this talk is that he's decided to step away from the gallery world, but still working with the artists in his own way, establishing a new center. I'm going to have him talking more about that in a little bit. But in the meantime, I'm going to welcome Tyler Rollins to Asia Society Hong Kong. Tyler, good morning, good evening. Tell us more about what you are doing, where you are joining us, and I want to start off by talking about your career. How did you get started in the world of representing Southeast Asian artists, and how do you start it in this area from your academic career in Yale and then London School of Economics and NYU? So,
thank you, Alice. It's so nice to be here, and it's just so nice to see you again. And yes, I'm sitting in Charleston right now, just by my little fireplace and having a cozy evening. So it's nice to see you bright and early in your morning. And I just want to say how supportive Asia Society has been over the years. And many of your patrons have really become dear friends, and all the directors of the museum in New York have just been so wonderful. I remember Melissa Chu came, was one of our first shows, and actually included some images in her Asian Art Now book in 2010. And of course, Boon Wee and now Michelle Yun is so wonderful. And so it's just so wonderful to kind of be part of that family. And of course, you've been so wonderful as well. I guess for me, I didn't study Asian contemporary art. It wasn't really even something that was really readily available, 30 years ago when I was as an undergraduate or even in graduate school. So it was really kind of through travel that unfortunately we've been missing out on recently, but that was really the connection for me. And so I started, I guess I first went to Hong Kong maybe in 1995 or something like that, and then to Southeast Asia around late 90s. And I was just so fascinated with just visiting, and I'm very interested in ancient culture and archaeology, all these kind of things. But then of course, wanting to meet contemporary artists. I was just so fortunate to meet a lot of the really major artists from the region, as well as some who were just becoming internationally known. And so it was really through them that I learned about the contemporary art scene. So in some way, it was a very personal, non-academic type of journey. But I've been so fortunate, after that, to have met so many leading academics, studying, writing about contemporary art in Southeast Asia. It sort of blossomed out, I would say, in the past 10 years or so in terms of knowledge in the West of that region.
And right now, your journey, when you started the gallery, it was 2008 in New York. And I think this is when we first met, I believe. We met through mutual friends like Ellen Kaplowitz. But I think it was around 2010 when I was working at MoCA. You introduced us. That was one of our first artist talk. You invited, we featured Jimmy Ong,
Yeah, that was,
Singapore, the
yeah,
Singaporean artist based in New York, I believe, at the time. And it was the
that-
first time I was seeing Southeast Asian artists. I was introduced to Southeast Asian artists in New York. So can you talk about the beginning of the gallery in 2008?
yes. Well, that show with Jimmy, which is the beginning of 2010, was about spiritual and religious themes. It was kind of reworking the Ramayana with the kind of feminist angle, and so it was kind of interesting. Our first interaction with you was relating to that. But yes, we started out in October. Actually, there had been many delays. We were supposed to open beginning of 2008, but cleverly we waited until October, which is the beginning of the financial crisis in New York, which was like an atomic bomb blast. But in a way, it kind of created a different narrative for us for the first year or so, and that was a time of retrenchment, people cutting back, a little bit clouded in terms of optimistic outlook. And so we were doing something very different and, very new, and it kind of seemed a bit risky, but also I think people were sort of thrilled to see something different. I remember speaking to a very cynical person in the art world who said, "Oh no, you're starting, do we really need a new Chelsea gallery?" But then when I explained what I was doing, and she said, "Wow, that is really something interesting and different." Because I would say at that time, there was, I think it's fair to say, very little awareness of Southeast Asian contemporary art, even within the Asian contemporary art world in New York. Tended to be focused more, China, India, Japan, things like that. So for me, it was very exciting. But I must say, I always really wanted and tried always to follow through on the idea of having the focus really be on the artist. So I never tried to make any kind of sweeping claims about Southeast Asia, because it's even more diverse region than many, so that those kind of sweeping statements and themes are very hard to do, particularly as someone from the United States. So for me, I just really wanted to put the focus on a selection of artists. Of course, I was the one who curated the artists, so it was kind of my taste, and we can talk about that in terms of some of the themes that I had been drawn to. But there again, I always wanted the artist to kind of be at the absolute forefront, because I thought really that's the best way to kind of learn about a region, is to really dive in deeply to particular artistic practice, and from there you can expand out rather than starting with sort of superficial tastes of this and that. So fortunately, many of the artists I've worked with for the entire time, and it was just a wonderful journey to be on together.
Well, I want to, and now, we'll talk about more about the your new journey. In some ways, it kind of history is repeating itself a little bit. 2021, I think you announced that you're going to kind of set aside the gallery world, and you're launching this Foundation for Spirituality and the Arts, FSA. And so tell us a little bit more about it, and maybe we can delve into it later on. But it's also a time of contemplation. Did COVID have something to do with this decision? Unlike the financial crisis, your gallery opened after the financial crisis. But 2021, what was your mindset in terms of establishing FSA, and what is your vision for that? In some ways, this is kind of the beginning of why I thought it would be great for us to have a talk. With this last 2 years, all of us, are dealing with the pandemic in various ways. And your decision about FSA, I found it very interesting. So I thought, oh, let's have a discussion, talk about that journey. So what led to this?
Yeah, I do
decision?
have an interesting sense of timing. I actually kind of really, at least in my mind, sort of really launched and kind of had first meetings right in the early March of 2020. Just right before they had some big announcements of, oh, this is actually serious. I remember we were going out to some parties at the Metropolitan Museum, and then a few days later it was suddenly going on. So it's in some ways a coincidence, but the whole narrative and trajectory really evolved a lot, sort of in certain sense, I hate to say inspired by, but kind of inspired by what's been happening in terms of, formulating exact plans and maybe accelerating some of them. I had really from the beginning, had been drawn to artistic practice and individual artists that had strong spiritual grounding, and particularly grounding in cultural practice, in a kind of sense of place and home, and a spirituality is always part of a place, even the spirit of a place. So not necessarily particular religious tradition, although our artists I work with, we're almost evenly divided between Christian and Buddhist and Muslim, but that was never a particular agenda of the gallery. But I realized, for my own interest, that I was kind of drawn to these themes, and actually would encourage artists to sometimes pursue these themes. As we all know, I mean, particularly in the United States, kind of spiritual, faith, religious issues are really not part of the mainstream of contemporary art, to say the least. So there's not as much, even commercially, but also in terms of the agendas of a lot of institutions. So it was something gradually I felt really merited its own organization. So I decided to call it Foundation for Spirituality and Arts, just to put that right out there, but also in a kind of welcoming way, without a particular, dogmatic agenda. But I really felt that there is such a lack of support in this area that even a small organization could have a wider impact. I think that was a lesson I learned from my experience with the Southeast Asian focus, because the gallery, we always remained, I wanted it to be a small, really focused operation. We didn't open, we've been approached about opening branches in Singapore or Hong Kong or different places, but I kind of wanted to keep it focused. But even with that, we were really able, I felt, to achieve enormous amounts, not only for the artists, but for the Southeast Asian scene awareness in the US, even in Europe. So I felt there's it's possible to make an impact even from a smaller scale base. I will say, I think nowadays there's a kind of sense that we want more from art than just entertainment or investment. And often when people think of a higher purpose, or when they name a higher purpose, it tends to be a political or social activism. These kind of things are what typically would come to mind in artistic discourse in the art world. So there's I feel, an enormous range of support structures for that. Major foundations, curators, institutions, et cetera. If an artist has those interests, you can really, find some attraction with that. On the other hand, if an artist has other, motivations of a more spiritual faith, or even just a more soulful approach, it's often not really encouraged. There's not as much of a language to even talk about that. So I feel like there's really a need there. Has that been your kind of impression as well?
I do. I think so. And I think what you said about, the Western institution or artists, in some ways it's almost taboo to tackle spirituality, religion. But due to COVID, I think I kind of get the sense that more of the we're taking comfort in art, but also in our spirituality, and that's why I think your timing couldn't be more perfect. So I do feel the same, and I seem to remember. Were you involved in when Sophia picks wonderful installation at the Met? And I think that was the first time I think a lot of the mainstream, Western audience has seen a work. As I recall, it was done from bamboo, correct?
Right.
I can't remember the name of the work, but it was so powerful to see a Southeast Asian artist, a young Southeast Asian, in the middle of the Buddhism um, gallery at the Met.
Picture of that I'll show later. But yeah, that was the first solo show I think they had done with a artist from Southeast Asia, which was in 2013. And it was throughout the Asian departments. It was about 10, some of them quite large scale works. But they did acquire two of them, which I think is so interesting. One is a more abstract grid, and then the other is, which they had shown some at the Met Breuer and in a more contemporary setting, and then the wonderful hanging Buddha piece, which was really has been on long-term view in the Khmer galleries around with the ancient statues. And so it just gives a wonderful different context, and that piece has a real spiritual aura about it that is enhanced by the context.
But I think going back to this year we're celebrating our 10th anniversary of this center. Asia Society Hong Kong is 30 years old. We were founded in 1989. But the gallery, our exhibition space, our gallery, our heritage site was only open. It was exactly 10 years ago. We were busy working on the opening of the center. And looking back now, that was our first, I know my colleague then, and working with Melissa, and I think Melissa at that time was still with us, as well as Vishaka, who was our president then, the Buddhism in art. The Buddhism in art show that Asia Society Hong Kong opened 10 years ago, I thought it was quite groundbreaking in terms of combining, Buddhism from the Buddhism collection from the Rockefeller collection, what beautiful arts, the traditional pieces from Japan, from Korea, from China, and then pairing it with contemporary artists from Asia on the Buddhism and art show, which I thought was quite groundbreaking at the time. And this would have been, we opened in February of 2012. So were you involved with that show at all? I'm sure, because some of the artists, as I recall, in fact, I think you might have been an artist because one of the artists might have been, some of the artists I think you might have been, have worked with.
Yeah, I know you've shown quite a few artists that I work with, as they have in New York and actually in Texas as well. So I feel like I've been to all wonderful spaces in a way. But I think that show was important in showing, it's sometimes difficult to do those shows because you don't want to pick artists that really have no connection with this, but it's sort of a gimmick. You have artists that do have some sense of affinities with not only the spirituality, but the iconography of ancient art, and that it really is a natural part of their process. And I was impressed when you were at the Museum of Chinese in America, because I thought you really brought in, contemporary artists, and it is so dynamic, whereas it could have been more of a museum about the past, but you kind of were able to bring in the contemporary connection as well. And I guess it's very different kind of way of doing that in the US versus somewhere in Asia or in Hong Kong. I think there's a different, we have, I think in the US, different issues, different sense of the past, and different communities that are served.
Well, I wish I could take credit for that, but I arrived when some of the shows were already in place by the curator, and I remember it was a show of Chinese contemporary artists working in New York. Some of them were Chinese Americans, and some of them were just people like Xu Bing, who had a studio in New York. And so I remember that show was another groundbreaking. You're right, because Museum of Chinese America before was talking about history, and that first show that also opened in 2009. They had it in 3 chapters, and some of the artists, again, some of them I had no idea were practicing or living in New York or had been in New York, and many of them have gone on to bigger, wonderful careers. But again, I think that's what my takeaway from New York, the 10 years I was there, was just there weren't that many, and you were kind of groundbreaking in terms of introducing to many of us. I remember going to SF MoMA. Was it? Yes, it was SF MoMA, seeing Tiffany Chung. I always get excited when I see names of artists that are Asian in major Western institutions. And it was, I think, around that time, Tiffany Chung. I had thought she was Chinese, but learning out later on she's Vietnamese American. But again, your friendship, I mean, you're introducing people like Sophia, Tiffany, and others. And then I think my last trip to Venice for the Biennale, many of the artists that you represented were like representing their home country in the gallery. So you must be really proud. That was 2019?
No, that
or 18.
I lose track. I think that was the one before that, maybe 17. But yeah, we had 3 artists at once, so we were just kind of had to organize multiple parties running around. It was quite thrilling, and Tiffany was doing it, Sophia, and quite a few others over the years. So those kind of things, of course, bring enormous, attention, and you could almost say validation to, not just the artist, but the particular direction they're going in. I think the artist sometimes, like with Sophia Pix, where he chose to really do some different work than what people were expecting, and Tiffany as well is kind of introducing her work relating to the Syria crisis at the time. So really kind of taking it in a new direction is sometimes a scary thing to do, and it's such a big world stage like that. I think for my gallery, we try to create sort of a more intimate environment that we kind of encouraging, a little bit thinking out of the box. And a lot of the shows we did were kind of had a non-commercial element to it. And that was always, quite thrilling as well. And I think that's something I'm, looking forward to continuing doing, and with a nonprofit model.
Well, before I wanted to talk about now some of the artists that you're artists that you're working that you are going to introduce us in terms of the work in their spirituality in their work. But before that, I just wanted to also let you know, a few weeks ago I was at M+, and those of you who are outside of Hong Kong, M+ is really a fantastic new museum that here in Hong Kong opened November after quite a few years planning. And it was wonderful to see Tiffany's work in one of the galleries that's very in a very wonderful place. And I know M+ is something that we're here in Hong Kong particularly proud of. And when Hong Kong have welcomes back in global visitors, I highly recommend the people checking out M+. But now let's talk about some of the artists that you want to kind of bring to our attention that in terms of the spirituality in their work. I feel like this last 2 years, and if all the scientists or some of the doctors are correct, it looks like COVID is here to stay for a while. And we've all been suffering through loss. I myself personally lost my father this last year, and I even before that, I think as we get older, I think the ideas of spirituality, where do we go after this life? And it's something that some of us have been thinking about, and this last 2 years we've been having a lot of time to think about why this. There's been a lot of losses, whether it's due to the pandemic or not. But so that's one of the reasons I think this topic has been very interesting. I find art and spirituality very soothing and very comforting during this time. So kind of tell us more about some of the artists that you're working with, and how are they bringing about, how have you worked with them? How have you discovered them in terms of, or encourage them in this spirituality journey?
Yeah, I think it has been a hopefully transformative time the past 2 years, but hopefully some good things will come out of it for each individual person. I think a lot of people have been thinking, what am I doing? Who cares about this? And also who cares about me? Who are my real friends? But I think this idea, for those of us in the art world, of course, we think, well, what is the value of what we're doing? And you kind of need some kind of grounding in that, I think, to keep you going, which I view as kind of a spiritual connection. And I think in terms of the artists, I think I would say, you can say most artists I know, and even most art lovers, have a sense of kind of a soulful connection in some way, that it bridges the gap. I think the artist connecting with something beyond himself, and the viewer of the art, the appreciator of the art, connecting with the artist, and then therefore with something else. So I think we think of this as a kind of exchange, or a flow in a way. I think the spiritual idea of sort of the individual being a kind of a vessel that we're receiving this kind of love and this light, and letting it pass through us to other people in our everyday lives. I think as an artistic creator, you're filtering it in a certain way, and you're sending out something that is also a part of your own creativity. So I am really drawn to that, and I think sometimes you can really sense that if you're looking at artwork. You get a sort of a feeling there that even if this is a genuine work, or if this is just a gimmick, or if this is something that has some other purpose to it that is not really connected to the soul. So, but I think there are many ways of approaching this, and I could, go through a few artists. I'm just going to focus on some that I've worked with over the years, because I feel like I have a kind of sense of their trajectory. But I think I always say there's kind of four ways of that spirituality and religion kind of function in contemporary art, which I kind of call the 4 E's. But one is a kind of evaluation, or sort of using art as a kind of form of socio-political commentary, or using religion as a means or an example of a critique. The other is exploration, a kind of often involving national or ethnic or personal identity. Then there's expression which is taking it to another level, sort of expression of your spirituality, of religious beliefs, but not necessarily in an overtly religious context. And then the last is a kind of embodiment, where the work is really embodying a particular religious tradition, kind of incorporating its iconography, like a Buddha image or something like that. So there are many different ways of kind of engaging, from the very more literal to the more abstract. And I think that it's just such a richness of possibility. Some people think it's limiting, but I really think it provides kind of avenues for creative exploration. Would you like me to quickly
Yes,
show?
please.
Okay, I'll get my screen share going here. Okay, I thought I'd just quickly go through just a few artists with a couple of works. This is a work by Aramayani, There we go. She's been focusing on spiritual issues really for her whole career. This was a piece from 1982 that where she was almost meditating in a kind of simulated archaeological discovery of kind of elements from the Hindu Buddhist past in Java kind of coming to surface again. This is a more recent performance she did at my gallery in 2016, which is referencing Tibetan Buddhism and its connections with Java. So this use of ceremony, kind of spiritual and religious language in her work, looking on to Pinari Sampatak. This is a kind of example of something a little more abstract. She's using the Buddhist stupa form, the shrine, and they kind of conflating it with the female breast. And then with the idea of nature and cycles of nature and kind of the feminine and the idea of the universal that can be embodied by the breast. And this was a piece that it's a little more abstract of these kind of hammocks, talking about almost a sense of emptiness and presence and absence, but here in the very neutral setting of the gallery. And then in 2013, we did a project at the LACMA, which it was set up in one of the Asian galleries around an ancient statue of Vishnu. So you see the context really influences or adds nuance to the work. This is another, more nuanced piece by Araya Rajdarmeransuk that was actually in that really groundbreaking Traditions Tensions exhibition in 1996 that organized through Asia Society, which I think was really the main introduction of Southeast Asia contemporary art in the US, and many of my artists were in that, many ones I worked with. Then this is a piece with a more literal focus. This is from her Village and Elsewhere video series. And this one, she had contemporary art images, this photographs from Jeff Koons and Cindy Sherman that was set up in the Buddhist temple near where she lives in northern Thailand. And the monks were trying to kind of give a Buddhist sermon based on these works instead of using the Buddhist paintings in the background. So another video work by FX Arsono, who was featured quite a bit in the After Darkness exhibition at Asia Society a few years ago. This is a video piece in which he used basically a church choir group in Java to perform a piece based on liturgical music, but talking about discrimination against the Chinese Indonesian communities. So kind of using religious themes, but also to comment about history and politics. This is another piece he did in my gallery, using these little electric lanterns like you see in sort of Chinese shrines, kind of floating over a sort of cenotaph with names written on it that is a kind of memorial to some of the victims of persecution and rioting during the 1940s against the Chinese Indonesian community. And the Chinese also more identify with Christianity and Buddhism. So there's a kind of link between the religion and the ethnic identity and history. This is, I guess, a little more overt use of religious symbolism from Manuel Ocampo, who often utilized images from Catholic church paintings. This is another piece where he's taking a traditional image of the cross with the instruments of torture during Christ's Passion, but replacing it with images relating to his own kind of artistic lineage. So it's a kind of personal icon in a way. This piece from Agus Sawage, another major Indonesian artist, called Ave Mariam, which has a kind of conflating the Virgin Mary, but also with Islamic attire, and then the artist's own face superimposed on it, kind of reflecting on his own identity as a Chinese Christian Indonesian who converted to Islam. So there again, the spiritual, it's a very spiritual work, but also very personal and very political work at the same time. This is another piece he did relating to the use of texts or religious texts to sometimes inspire more fundamentalist violence. So the very sensitive political commentary, but also about what is faith, what does that really mean in action. And then I wanted to close with, so Sophie, I picked, this is the piece that I had loaned to Asian Society Hong Kong for a number of years, that you associate Sophia's work with sometimes with these more abstract pieces. And this was the Buddha piece that we were talking about, which is part of a series of images based on childhood recollections of traveling around the country after the Khmer Rouge were kind of vanquished, and he went into a temple that the statues had been shot up and there was blood everywhere, and it was a very formative memory, and then kind of translating that into using this iconic form of the Khmer style Buddha. And is it disintegrating, or is it reforming? It's that ambiguity and sense of motion. So I'll just stop with that, but I wanted to just kind of use that as an example of just the huge, variety of expression that, this whole concept of spirituality in the art can lead to, or, these are themes that run throughout these works, but many of them were not really approached that way until suddenly they might have been shown like at, in a gallery of religious images. Then of course it comes up. So I think just being able to open conversations about what artists are actually doing and inspired by, not imposing something on them, but I think just opening that up. I think this is something that can, benefit the art world, and not, I'm really interested in this idea of learning from different communities. And sometimes in the art world, we think of, we are sort of the enlightened ones who are preaching to the masses in a way. And I think, the art world has so much to learn, I think, from the more spiritual communities as well. So I really like this idea of the two-way street in a way.
So is it one of the reasons you founded this nonprofit foundation for spirituality and the arts? You feel, because that's, your reason for finding FSA, because one of the things that I wanted to also ask you in your presentation, there's been these wonderful images. And it's also pretty recent in terms of the working with the museums. Some of maybe Asia Society was ahead of the curve, but what is the importance of the museum? I think also my sense is that some of these, especially the Western cultural institution, not that the Asian cultural institution are not doing it, it's just that Asian cultural institutions are still kind of brand new. They look like M+ and some of the museum that will be coming up. But I'm just curious, is the role of the Western cultural institutions foundation in supporting this ecosystem of do you think COVID will have something to do with it, or Black Lives Matters? Are they going through some sort of soul searching? In terms of connecting, with the community through spirituality, or I know this is a big question, but I'm just curious because you work with these cultural institutions. Do you think they're getting it?
And I've been fortunate to work, with institutions all over the world, a lot in Asia. Interestingly, I sold a lot of works to major Asian museums as well as the U.S. and Europe. So and in the U.S., I've really been so personally interested in working with regional museums and kind of getting outside of the major centers. So I feel like I have a pretty broad understanding. I think the issues are very different right now in the US versus Asia. I mean, just speaking broadly, I think there is a lot of soul searching, and I think still a kind of default position is to talk about socio-political engagement, that sort of model. Which is fine, but I also feel there's this whole other side, which is a kind of spiritual side, which I think museums sort of feel very uncomfortable sometimes, not quite sure how to deal with that. I think that's something that really needs to evolve, and hopefully with I think everybody doing a bit of soul searching. I mean, just the whole word soul searching implies, you're looking beyond just the intellect. So I think that's something to really foster. I think there are taboos in every culture. I know just in Asia, or in many parts of the world, you wouldn't really see, art being in institutions that is very critical of a religious or a particular ethnic group. There's always a fear of fostering communal violence or these other kind of reasons that you have this kind of restrictions. Whereas in the US, that, sometimes a lot of the images or the works you see relating to religion specifically are very critical. It's almost the opposite. So I think different parts of the world have a lot to learn from each other. I mean, did you find when coming from the New York art world to Hong Kong, it's quite a different context, and how do you sort of navigate that in a way?
Well, I think the almost a decade that I spent in New York, I visited. I just love. One of the reasons living in New York was these wonderful cultural institutions, whether it's visual arts or performing arts, and I think on the performing arts space, I could see more people who look like me in terms of on the stage, and I'm talking about music, classical music, for example. Not so much on maybe some on Broadway or some on. So I think in terms of representation, I didn't. The museums were beginning to, but again, Asia Society, of course, because being Asia Society, but it just. I didn't see that, for me, being in New York was really exploring the Western traditions. I didn't, occasionally I would see something that was, oh, I did not know that about these Asian artists. You wouldn't go to the Met to see Asian art. I mean, you would have the Sophia pieces, and it seems to me a bit more rigid. I don't know if I'm generalizing here, and I think you have experiences, like you said, with dealing with the institution. So I consume art in terms of going to the Guggenheim, in terms of going to the. I didn't go there. There weren't that many. I think more recently, this last decade, I think Asia Society Hong Kong, we work with the Guggenheim, contemporary art of Southeast Asia, and I remember Raya was one of the artists. So I think that was more recent. And it was seeing her work was, wow, what a interesting woman, Thai woman artist in terms of what the stuff that she was doing. But it's more recent, and I didn't see that much of it in New York. It was hanging out with you, meeting people like Jimmy, but for me, my visual art journey was back here in Hong Kong. I've been back now 10 years, and just seeing the growth, not just here in Hong Kong, but our Art Basel has a lot to do with it, Art Central, the art fair. But is that what you're seeing too? I mean, you also, my understanding, when we talked, you come every year for Art Basel, and you would be going to Middle East. Are you also seeing some of the changes? Everybody is I'm talking about Middle East, religiosity or spirituality. So I think you have a wonderful view of having dealt with whether on the commercial side or the art fair. How are they consuming art in a way? The cultural institution, how are they representing it? I haven't been to the Louvre, Abu Dhabi. I'm looking forward to doing to that. So
Yeah, that's a good example. Or the
yeah,
new Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, it's assembled a quite interesting collection as well. I've been a little bit involved in. Yes, I think there's I guess a sense of wanting to be globally aware, and so there's one thing to just say, oh, we have to have artists from different parts of the world, but just clicking a box is one thing. But I think how do you really have a global collection without it being just very superficial or greatest hits? And I think another element of that as well is a kind of spiritual depth to the works. And I think art that really has a lasting impact is often something that has a really deep sense of connection to something beyond even just the artist's own time. I think so many times you can be inspired by an artwork of about a particular religious theme, or someone who's just a very spiritual person, and you're not necessarily going to adopt their viewpoint, but just seeing that there's this possibility that people can have these very grounded, rich lives, I think is inspiring for all of us to even just delve into our own heritage and traditions, to really explore that is within us. And sometimes that can be inspired from someone else. And we're just as we're inspired by maybe a neighbor who is just particularly kind and thoughtful, also with an artwork that I think really brings out some quality in yourself by seeing the way someone else has reflected and expressed something so profound or beautiful. So I think that's what hopefully would be a model going forward, is to be a little bit more sensitive to those kind of issues. Yes, we want to have a kind of geographical diversity and all of that, but I think by what category do we choose these artists? And I think we don't want everything to just reflect our own particular views and biases, but I think seeing what others are really exploring profoundly, whether or not that's something that is of your own tradition, but I think it just inspires you to be, looking more deeply into your own vision and beliefs. So I think that whole idea of just openness and sharing, and kind of a smooth flow from the interior to the exterior and back is a kind of a spiritual path, whatever we want to call it. And I think that's really bound up with the whole, I think, just motivation for art, and why it's always been a part of every culture we've ever uncovered, is something very profound there. And so sometimes with contemporary art, we can get so wrapped up in, what's hot now, or what is really expressing what my particular situation is at the moment. You can become a little myopic. And so I just think the idea of opening up is something hopefully we can come out of this pandemic. I think everyone has this yearning to reconnect, or even just touch someone else without fearing contagion, So touching someone on a screen.
Questions in, and we have a wonderful question from Rachel Cooper, my colleague in New York, who's our longtime culture ambassador. And Rachel, who is very familiar with Southeast Asia and performances, she says religion is only one aspect of the journey. The spiritual nature may not always be tied to a religion, but to experience. She said in the performing arts, dance, music, storytelling, the live arts are often about practice. And so I guess her question is, however, live arts are time-based, different from visual arts. Asian Society has been a major collaborator commissioner in the performing arts. Perhaps the boundary between contemporary and traditional is more blurred in the live arts. Her question is, how are you seeing the creative collaboration and how we take in, combining live and visual arts?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Rachel is saying. I actually was meeting with someone who is very involved with directing performance festivals, and she was saying that that these type of issues I was talking about in terms of separation between spirituality and art it doesn't really apply into a lot of performance. I mean, particularly music, which has long been connected with religious performance and ritual, for example. So I really am interested in the kind of connections between what used to be considered different, discrete art forms. That's why I think performance art in all its forms is so key in some ways to that. Visual art that's more static obviously has very different issues with the idea of time and development, which you see much more opportunity in sort of time-related artwork. Some artists I know have done, collaborations, for example, with musicians, choreographers, even taking sculptural pieces that were intended really as a standalone object, but then very generously working with other performers to kind of incorporate that. We've done that with Sophia Pick and Pinari, Sampatak, several of the artists that I was showing you images of. So I think this is a really very fertile ground. It just takes a particular level of, I think, openness among the artists to, collaborate in this sense. So I think that performance is one of the key ways of kind of opening up this dialogue, because it does, I totally agree, it does have a less rigid structure, which I think is kind of built into the nature of time-related work.
Mm-hmm. Here we have a question coming in from Slido. Those of you who are interested, please feel free to ask, send your question in through Slido. But here, one question asks, how do you navigate cross-cultural communication and the nuance of sensitive topics?
Yeah, that's a big issue. I think as things have become so globalized, we're dealing with different national traditions, different taboos, as we kind of mentioned, and even with our in our own countries, it's such a range. So I think it's you can have institutional policies relating to this, but I think it really comes down to the human element. And I think this whole idea of empathy and humility, I think these are two of the most important virtues that I think we just need to foster, particularly I think they're so linked, but this idea that, we don't know everything. We really, want to learn from other people, kind of share, I think on just a human level, and before taking it to a more institutional framework. I mean, I know, you're in an institution, obviously you have policies, you have ways of handling these things efficiently, but then sometimes there's a more, soulful way of bridging these barriers between people.
Yeah, I think, what I've found interesting in some of the shows we've put together this last 10 years, it's been, I can't believe it's been over 30 shows. And what I find interesting is really the commonality, the humanity of the work. It's, it could be a Chinese artist talking about, police violence, but it's something that happened in the 60s. And a lot of the stuff resonates. If you're talking about, like what you said is so true about empathy and humility, there are just these common themes, regardless of where these artists coming from. When you see something that struck a chord, for me, it's like, wow, that's so powerful, whether it's going to, if you're seeing it as an Asian or American or wherever you are, when something hits, you just kind of realize, yeah, this artist is saying something that appeals, that universality, that humanity. And that's how I think every show has been my favorite show, but there was just time when like, it's almost, I don't know how to describe it, but there is a spirituality. It hits your heart. You get it, and sometimes I look at an artwork, it's you understand where the artist is coming from, where they're thinking. But when it touches, if whether it's me or somebody younger or somebody older, when it hits, it's something I don't know how to explain it, but I've seen. Well, how do you? I just can't describe it in terms of. But I think artists have a way of kind of when you were talking about F.A. Harsano earlier. I did not know that much about his work, and he did a performance here at Asia Society as part of a conference, and seeing it and what he's talking about in terms of discrimination of in Indonesia, Chinese being, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you just now look at what's happening in the States. And it's kind of like, oh, it's not that unique. Somebody that FX has captured it rather than anti-Asian discrimination in America. He's talked about it in Indonesia that happened decades ago. That's the theme still resonates. And it's not just anti-Asian, any discrimination. When these artists hit on these themes, it just has a way of illuminating for me. I don't know if that makes sense. And that's one of the reasons I find the artists, their tool is so powerful. You may not know that much about history of, Chinese Indonesia or Chinese America, but when the work in that brevity, in that work, whether it's visual art or performing art, when they can interpret that idea in so succinctly and so beautifully to an audience that has nothing about it, that to me is really quite powerful. That I find we don't hear enough of it. I think in definitely when I was in New York, I felt like we didn't hear enough of it from artists outside of non-Western artists. And I think maybe when I was in New York, this was also after 9/11. The baggage of talk about religious, religious tolerance. I think sometimes it's really hard to, in Western society, everything is black and white, or not just Western society. A lot of time, institution, you have buckets and the silos, and I think that's one of the reasons some of the artists, I think, they're able to cross boundaries in terms of sharing their work, so an audience can get it without.
Yeah. Certainly for me personally, just working with these artists from Southeast Asia has just been so enriching for my own life. And I look forward to, continuing that. And we're hoping to bring some artists from Southeast Asia as part of our residency program in Charleston. So hoping to find some partnerships with people in Southeast Asia to sponsor artists to come and work with the communities here in a very organic way. And I just think it's often just the individual who can communicate so much just from the personal inspiration that they provide. And I've just been amazed just so many times seeing artists and works resonate that are, seem totally foreign to some people, but when they really delve into it, they find this enormous inspiration from them. So I think that's a lot of the power of art, if we really kind of slow down and allow ourselves to kind of feel a connection through it.
Well, I want to applaud you for this, the founding of this nonprofit and also the residency component. I feel like in this day and age where due to COVID and even pre-COVID, I think everybody's in their corners. If you're not for us, you're against us type feeling.
Right.
And there's not that connectivity. Everybody, especially this here in Asia, many of the, we're kind of locked down or we're not traveling. When was the last time you traveled?
I mean, I've been
To
traveling.
Asia.
I haven't been to Asia now. It's usually I would go 3 times a year at least. And yeah, but it's been two years, I guess. It's hard to believe. And not having seen so many of my friends in person has been very hard.
Well, we look forward to welcoming you to Hong Kong, hopefully sometime this year.
I hope so.
But I know, Hong Kong, we're alive and well. We really look forward to when this, if whatever the zero COVID policy means, but in the meantime, we really do look forward when we can travel again and be connected. And I think what you're doing with your foundation, I'm looking forward to hearing more about it, and maybe we can revisit later. I think it's very important that we connect, and art, I find, is a wonderful way of connecting. And although we can't connect in person, we can connect online, and this is not the best thing, but the next best thing. And so it's so great talking to you, Tyler. And I want to thank those of you for joining us. And I saw a message from Ellen Kaplowitz. Hello, Ellen, for connecting us. Almost 2 decades ago and also Curtis, I think, was another connection. And so it's great to see you, even though we're not together. I look forward to welcoming you in person back to Hong Kong and in the near future. And thank you, those who joined us on Zoom and on online. And we look forward to welcome you to Asia Society Hong Kong when we reopen, hopefully after Chinese New Year on February 4th, if there's no other changes. But I know, although we can't connect in person, we can still connect online. So thank you all for joining us.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.